couple of years ago now when Captain Marvel came out, and seeing the way that people were talking about this movie as though it was the first time ever that, little girls could watch a superhero film and feel connected to the story was infuriating to me. It was like, there are lots and lots more stories out there, and they are for little girls too. And the reason we connect to them is because there's something human in it, the sense of adventure and the sense of fear. We connect with what these characters are feeling because they're people, or, hobbits as the case may be. But the idea is that you don't need to share these surface level identity characteristics with somebody to find their journey compelling.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Ricky Orpike, and joining me once again is Mr. Jonathan Astro. How are you?
I'm good, Ricky.
So, who have we got on the cards today?
Kat Rosenfield, author, podcaster, fantastic. Conversation with her was just absolutely fascinating. We don't get to talk about books and fiction and storytelling. We did throw her some curveballs as well. We talked about some pretty random stuff. We actually geeked out on Game of Thrones.
We did,
as well.
Yeah, which was excellent.
That was unstoppable. I couldn't help myself.
Yeah.
So as you can tell, I'm all aflutter. It was wonderful, and yeah, we've got to come back. All right, well that's it.
Let's do it.
Kat Rosenfield is a published author, cultural critic and podcaster. Her work has appeared in Wired, Vulture, Entertainment Weekly, Playboy, Reason and UnHeard. She is the co-host of a weekly podcast called Feminine Chaos with Phoebe Maltz-Bovey. Her 2021 novel, No One Will Miss Her, has been nominated for the Edgar Award, and she has a new book in the works, which we will definitely ask her about. Kat, welcome to The New Flesh.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, Americans have a weird fascination with the British royal family. With the Queen's passing, we've seen a number of different takes, some praising the Queen for her tireless service, others seemingly dancing on her grave. College professor Uju Anya, and I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce her name, she tweeted, "I heard the chief monarch of a thieving, raping, genocidal empire is finally dying. May her pain be excruciating." Now, what have you made of America's outpouring of grief and outrage? Shouldn't Americans just shrug and get on with things?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the response to the Queen's death seems to highlight to me the fact that all of our engagement as Americans with the British monarchy really takes place through the lens of pop culture. We mostly watch these as like dramatized stories. I mean, it's, historical nonfiction or whatever, but we watch it dramatized on television. We watch The Crown, so we understand it through that lens and that context. And I think that it's easy then to forget that these are actually real people. And it's easy then for the expression of incredibly over-the-top sort of malice, like Uju Anya's tweet, to find a place in the conversation just because none of it really seems especially real to us.
Yes, that tweet was like wrestling heel behavior. Like it was real, just riling up the crowd, staring in their eyes and saying, "I'm the bad guy now."
Yeah, that's funny. That's a good way to think about it. I was thinking that, it's the kind of thing that if like Cersei Lannister had said it on Game of Thrones, we would have found it over the top. We'd have been like, come on.
Yes. Well, we have some questions about Game of Thrones we might get to a bit later, but just on this whole royal thing, you've written about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle and their interview with Oprah. Since then, there have been more allegations of racism. Meghan's released her Saccharine podcast where she whines about how hard her life is. They left the Royal Kingdom claiming a desire for more privacy, but they haven't stopped pushing their initiatives, their Netflix shows and woke charities. Meghan is slowly revealing herself not to be the Cinderella we thought she was, but more the evil queen. Is anyone in America still rooting for Meghan? And as an aside, is Harry the biggest cuck in the history of cucks?
I wasn't expecting that particular question. I'm gonna just defer on the question of whether Harry is a cuck. I've never said that word out loud. Wow, it's got kind of a nice mouthfeel though. Anyway, but Meghan, yeah, she actually. I think that lots and lots of people are still rooting for her because she is sort of an iteration of this Cinderella story, but kind of with a feminist twist. It's like instead of, going and being chosen by the prince and living the rest of her life happily ever after in a palace, she took the prince back to America, estranged him from his family. Like, she wins, And although I don't particularly feel one way or another about her, I think that there's something about that narrative that is compelling, especially to an American audience.
I thought she looked fabulous, I got to say. It's just an aside. I looked at her, because it's been in such bad press, and when I saw her outfit, I was like, oh, stunning.
At the funeral?
Excellent work. Yeah, well, yes, at the funeral. So is that bad taste?
No,
Anyway, we'll move on.
it's good that she had a good funeral outfit. I mean, imagine the scandal if she had worn a bad one.
Yes, true. I could. Those stories would write themselves. Well, perhaps we'll move on from the royals. Look, one of the main reasons we've got you on the show, so we've complained for a while now that we're in a bit of a dark age in terms of art. Books, movies, music, creativity seems to be under attack from forces internal and external, forces intent on pushing ideas and outcomes from the top down. It's sort of like my view is that it sometimes seems like a fevered, morally upright snitch culture that sort of has zero reverence for the past. But I'm interested in your take on the current state of the arts. What do you think's going on out there, Kat?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. I mean, as you talked about reverence for the past, one of the things that is driving so much of pop culture right now actually is almost a sort of a rose-colored glasses idea of the past. Like, there's this sort of nostalgia, but not for anything before like 1980. It's all rooted in the nostalgia for properties and stories and characters that the people who are making movies and television and writing books now, the stories that they grew up with. So like Ghostbusters, or E.T. You have like the sort of Spielbergian collection of ragtag kids thing that's manifesting itself now in Stranger Things. So yeah, I mean, I think that on the one hand, yes, it's true. There's been this quest to sort of problematize anything that was created, in the dark ages of 30 years ago, for having less than progressive political themes embedded in it. But at the same time, there's this intense desire to like recreate the experience that the people who are making films now had when they watched something like The Hobbit as a kid, or Ghostbusters as a kid. They're sort of trying to get back to something that captured them in their youth. And I do think that it's actually, it's making the entire landscape very samey. We have now nothing really, I mean, all the big sort of tentpole blockbuster movies are coming out of, two particular comic book universes. And that's sort of what's there now. It's really, even as budgets for films like this have gotten so much bigger, the range of what you're seeing on screen has gotten quite small.
What do you think about the current notion of representation in art? Because that term gets thrown around endlessly at the moment.
Yeah, to me, it's a facile way of thinking about an issue that has legitimate aspects to it. I mean, if you want to talk about what's happening in Hollywood, obviously that's it's an industry dominated by people who come from a particular sort of background. And that's not even a racial background. It's more people with connections, people who have family wealth or family ties to Hollywood already. And that's who ends up working in the industry, by and large. And people who have that type of background also tend to look a certain way. They tend to be white. But that's more of a class issue. Anyway, so the thing with diversity in Hollywood is that you want, ideally, a greater range of people to be able to work on films like behind the scenes. You want people, operating the camera or writing the stories or, all of this stuff. I mean, a movie production crew is a huge thing. There's thousands of people involved in it. And you'd like to see better opportunities for a wider variety of people on that front. But representation obsesses with one thing and one thing only, which is what do the people on the screen look like? And I find that very frustrating because I think it's just a really facile way of trying to describe how people actually engage with art and engage with storytelling, it's just not accurate to the way that human beings connect with stories, that you first look for somebody on screen who looks like you. That's just not how it works. That's not how it happens.
It seems to be built on as you say, that seems to be the stupidest thing about it is I think back to everything I watched, well, that I've ever watched. And, obviously, because we're straight white guys, so we're sort of le bête noir figures. So saying like, oh, yes, I identified with, Baby and Dirty Dancing or whatever, that doesn't hold much resonance now. But it's true. I watched that movie and I used to get busted up about that.
Yeah, nobody puts you in a corner, huh?
Nobody puts me in a corner, that's for sure. But and this might be even more controversial, but when I was like a teenager in the 90s, I mean, I used to watch Malcolm X over and over again and stuff, and like I read it all, read his biography because of the autobiography because of the movie and all of that, and I don't know, like it didn't occur to me that I should stay in my lane.
Yeah, no, of course not. I mean, I had a moment with respect to this stuff a couple of years ago now when Captain Marvel came out, and seeing the way that people were talking about this movie as though it was the first time ever that little girls could watch a superhero film and feel connected to the story was infuriating to me. It was like, there are lots and lots more stories out there, and they are for little girls too, and the reason we connect to them is because there's something human in it, the sense of adventure and the sense of fear. We connect with what these characters are feeling because they're people, or hobbits, as the case may be. But the idea is that you don't need to share these surface level identity characteristics with somebody to find their journey compelling.
Well, and frustrating us even more is that you need to see the thing to identify with the thing, but then you need to be the thing to act the thing.
That's right.
So you need to be, so for example, like if it's Philadelphia and we're doing Philadelphia now, the remake, we need to make sure that you're gay. Follow you after work and say, okay, are you really gay? Do you really have AIDS? Like we've got to go through the whole thing. So it's just as silly, really.
Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting aspect of this that's happening in the world of fiction writing right now, where authors, and it seems like it's always women who are especially being charged with this sort of like extra level of scrutiny, but they are being asked to expose really private aspects of their lives or their identities or their experiences in order to prove that they have the right to tell a certain story. There was this thing that happened, again, I guess maybe a couple of years ago, with a book called My Dark Vanessa, where this author had written a novel about a woman re-examining her relationship with a teacher that she had had when she was a teenager. So it was one of these student-teacher relationships, and she was coming to it through a different lens now, thinking, was this exploitive? And somebody accused her of, another writer accused her of like appropriating her memoir. This was a book that basically nobody had read, and appropriating her experience. And this poor woman had to come out publicly and say, no, I actually slept with a teacher when I was a teenager. So I do know what I'm talking about. But she shouldn't have had to do that. It was really just, repulsive that she had to.
Yeah, that's dreadful, and it would have been traumatic, and would have implicated the teacher. And I mean, that's almost a movie in itself. So that's terrible. Why can't you just write and people read it, and either it's good or it's not?
I mean, I guess the answer to that is that you can. The choice to participate in this aspect of the discourse surrounding art at the moment is still a choice, and if the worst people on Twitter want to come after you for your, decision to use your imagination as a writer, or to, decline to answer intrusive questions about your private life, you can still ignore them. It I guess depends a little bit on whether you're in a social or professional bubble where that type of criticism carries a lot of weight. I'm fortunate that, for me, Not that anyone has come after me about this, but if they did, I feel like I would be comfortably able to ignore it.
Well, you've got real world experience in this field because you've published a suspense novel called No One Will Miss Her. And I'm interested to know what was the process like writing this novel? Because, at one point in history, you only had to worry about the paralysis of living up to the great works. These days, you've got that added paralysis that can come when you start to imagine which groups you'll offend and how you'll get doxxed. So, how did you conquer this problem, or did it just sort of come naturally to you?
I mean, the question of whether my identity aligned with the identity of the characters is something I just genuinely did not think about. It's not a concern for me as a writer. As far as the process of creating the story, it's an idea that I had, at this point, it must have been like 6 or 7 years ago. And I sat on it for a long time, sort of noodling on it and developing it way before I ever started to actually write the story, because I felt like I had something good and I wanted to make sure I did it justice. This is my first novel for adults. Prior to this, I was a young adult fiction writer. My last young adult book came out in 2014, so this is a pivot for me to, writing more adult fare.
Did you employ a sensitivity reader?
No.
Could you perhaps explain to our audience what is a sensitivity reader?
Okay, a sensitivity reader is sort of a consultant hired during the manuscript stage of a book, either by the author or by the author's publisher. And the idea is that person is going to be a person from a given background, usually a marginalized racial, ethnic, sexual, gender, whatever background, all those categories that we consider of great importance right now. And this person is going to read the book in which you've written characters that share that person's background, and they're going to tell you if you got the characters, quote unquote, right, or if you're being offensive. And this is something that started in young adult fiction, and we can talk if you want about sort of the origins of that. It's an interesting story, but it's now starting.
I had no idea that it started there.
Oh yeah. A lot of this stuff incubates in young adult fiction. Anytime you have a moral panic, the fact that there's content aimed at teenagers makes it a good place to kind of get that going, for it to take root, because it's very easy to invoke the specter of a vulnerable young person, reading the wrong thing and being harmed by it.
Sometimes I'm worried about when they say what the right thing is, I'm really worried about that. You know what I mean? Like they go, the right thing for them to be reading is about all this stuff, and then I look at it and I go, oh, geez, that sounds niche.
I mean, at this point, if kids are reading it all, I think it's a net win.
It's true. That's true.
That's true. Yes. No, I'm not one of those parents at the meetings.
It's interesting though, because perhaps 20, 30 years ago, that sort of concern, that moral panic, would have come from the conservative side of politics, but now we're seeing it more on the progressive side. Do you find that interesting?
Yeah, and discouraging. I mean, especially as somebody who, works in a creative field and is old enough to remember when it was the religious right who was trying to, basically take away all of the stories that were fun or edgy or spoke to us as teenagers. To see how the script has flipped is odd and not great.
I miss those days. They were. I don't know. It was something I understood. I was like, I want to listen to Marilyn Manson, and they want to ban it. They want to ban him. So that's simple. That's a simple narrative I can follow. This new thing, I don't know the rules. Like people who were great turning around and sort of telling me what to do. It's hard to keep track of.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if you sort of look into it, there's a method to the madness, but as much as this stuff is, in some cases, genuinely rooted in a desire to, do what's best for young readers, it's also fueled by a lot of professional competition and jealousy in an industry that is contracting, where there are few opportunities, where people are always looking for ways to kind of give themselves a leg up in the playing field by disqualifying whoever they perceive to be their competition. So it's complicated.
Well, you mentioned sensitivity readers and the origins in YA. Would you mind circling back to that for a second and filling us in?
Yeah. So young adult fiction gosh, let's see where to start. How far back do I want to go? Let's talk about 2014. 2014 was when there was the start of this big kind of diversity reckoning in young adult fiction. There was a study released by Lee and Low that uncovered trends surrounding diversity in YA. And what they found was that something like only 10% of the books that were being written included quote unquote diverse characters. So, characters from like non-white, non-straight backgrounds. This caused a scandal, which is reasonable. And so immediately people started writing many, many more diverse characters into their books. The problem with that is that the authorship of these books was still extremely predominantly white, middle-aged women. So you had now all of these books about diverse characters being written by a non-diverse group of writers. This is obviously not what the people who were, activating on behalf of diversity had in mind. And at this point, this idea emerged that it wasn't enough to include diverse characters in your books, that you needed to share your identity characteristics with those characters. Or if you didn't, you were basically, it was like a stolen valor sort of a thing. You were stealing or appropriating an experience, an identity that didn't belong to you. You were, in doing so, taking up space on the shelf from a marginalized writer who could have told this story better than you, more authentically than you. And the idea really at that time was, if you want to write a character who doesn't share your ethnic or racial or sexual background, don't. You're doing something bad. But if you're going to, then at least employ a sensitivity reader to tell you if you're getting that character right. Obviously, this leads, in its, like, if you take it to the end, to its logical conclusion, this leads to an incredible narrowing of what kind of characters people are allowed to write. I mean, you can slice that down as thin as you like until it's about, basically nothing being available to any writer except autobiographical novels about a character who is basically them. But in the meantime, this notion of sensitivity reading did give, for publishers, it gave people from marginalized backgrounds a little slice of space at the table. It allowed them to kind of point to the inclusion of sensitivity readers, and they're freelancers, by the way, and they don't get paid very much. So you can hire like a ton of them. You could hire 100 of them for just a few $1,000s. So publishers were able to point to this and say, look at all we're doing for diversity. And I think that for that reason, sensitivity reading caught on as a sort of an industry standard. And again, it's not across the board, but it's starting to be more prevalent, even as it was initially created as a sort of almost a check on people who wanted to write characters who were outside their own identities, to make them think twice about doing so, if that makes sense. That was a really long-winded answer, sorry.
No, that's perfect. Quick question. Now, obviously, these sensitivity readers, where are they coming from? Are they, apart from being a certain ethnicity or gender identity or whatever, are they skilled in the craft of writing? Are they able to help you solve creative problems, or is it just critique we're getting?
They're not writers. It's interesting that you say, like, where do they come from? There are people who seek out this type of work, who advertise themselves as sensitivity readers. There are databases where you can, basically click a bunch of boxes and find somebody who matches the characteristics that you're looking for. The question is, what kind of person volunteers for this job? Like, imagines themselves to be really good to do this job. That's going to be a particular type of person. A
professional offended person.
You said it, not me.
No, I just think this whole thing is so epically stupid. I don't understand how you would even come up with this idea. How you could sit in a room with presumably college educated people, and they would come up with this idea, and that everyone would just let it happen. And that no one would look around and say, hey, wait, if we think this through, there's so many hazards in this. This is anti-creativity. Like, we don't want people, we don't want Ricky writing, the Martin Luther King story, But at the same time, there are some people who might be able to pull it off. I'm not sure. The rules are. I just think that this idea is profound. I'm getting really petulant about it, but I can't help but think that this idea is really, really stupid.
Yeah, no, I think it is, and I think maybe to refine the point a little bit, it essentially makes writing fiction impossible. The other thing about it too, that's just worth noting is, even though we often talk about this in terms of the impact on, white male straight writers who are being told that they can't write X, Y, and Z, this is not just something that impacts people from groups that we're supposedly unsympathetic to, because the result of this sort of identitarian ethos in storytelling is that writers from marginalized backgrounds get pigeonholed into only writing stories about characters who are like them. And a lot of them don't want to do that. And I wrote for Reason about sensitivity readers. And in the course of doing this, I interviewed a guy, Alberto Galaba, who is a writer of Filipino descent, but he wrote this great novel called University Thugs that takes place at a college campus that's sort of like a thinly veiled facsimile of UVA here in the States. And the protagonist is a young Black man who I think is like an ex-con or a juvenile offender. And it's a really rich, textured, incredible story. And, I don't think that another writer could have told it as well as Galaba did. But because his identity didn't match the identity of the characters, he ran into basically insurmountable obstacles at the point at which he was trying to publish it, and he had to self-publish. And that's a damn shame.
Do you think the solution is an anonymity where everyone just is anonymous?
Like blind auditions to be
no,
a writer?
what I'm saying in terms of authorship, so you would take on a pseudonym, or people wouldn't know your background, and then they would just have to assess the work on its own merits.
I mean, I think that that's a great way to basically ensure that quality writing and compelling, well-told stories end up rising to the top. Yeah, but you'll never get that because it's this idea of identity as something inherently valuable to the publishing process is increasingly kind of baked into the system.
So drawing from your comment there, so publishers, that they see a financial incentive to sort of brand their books with some sort of a minority status. Is that fair to say?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's sort of, it's always been a thing that who the author is matters. And, in years past, or decades past rather, the things that helped you sell books as an author, irrespective of the quality of your writing, how to put this, if you were really hot, basically. So like when Zadie Smith's novel was going out, her publisher sent around a headshot of her with the press materials. And that's because Zadie Smith is drop dead gorgeous and people get excited about covering books written by beautiful people. At this point, being really beautiful is probably less of a boon to you in publishing than being from a marginalized background, because that's what makes the story compelling now. But yeah, it's always mattered. It's just, what we think matters about it has shifted a little.
Again, I've got a very childish view of this. Isn't the existence of someone like Shakespeare, isn't his abundance and his philosophy, isn't that embarrassing to this idea of identity mattering? I
mean, it's not embarrassing to the people who believe it. They would say that Shakespeare was an old dead white man who probably shouldn't have strayed so far from his lane. But
yeah, I suppose.
But yeah, I mean, I think at this point you find people, even within the writing profession, kind of sorting into two fields. And there are those who think that imagination is permissible and desirable for a person who writes fiction, and then there are those who don't.
Yes, no, that's I haven't thought about it like that, but you're absolutely right. We've sort of gotten it's Lionel Shriver's sort of attitude, which is I'll write what I want, and then we've got everyone else. But the question then remains is, will the heavy hitters always, in terms of publishing companies and that whole track of being able to write books in that way, will they always be aligned with the more morally upright side, shall we say, seeming side?
That's a good question. I mean, I feel like if you look at the New York Times bestseller list, or you look at what is selling, what people are talking about, the stories that people actually like to read, they're not really reading books based on the author's identity or the author's adherence to, certain progressive pieties in their work. What they're reading for is a good story. And so I think no matter how much the publishing industry entrenches itself in this particular way of looking at creative work as, some kind of a form of activism, you still will never be able to escape the desire of people who read to read good stories.
True. Yes. Well, I've just had a thought about the you mentioned the audience there. So this is all big sky stuff. So just don't stay with me. But do you think there's too much emphasis placed on what the author supposedly deserves, as opposed to what the audience deserves? Because it seems to be this idea that everyone deserves a job in publishing or deserves to be a top 10 author or something. I get this sense out there. And I always like to think of, William Blake dying in obscurity or Mozart dying as a pauper or something when I think about what I'm owed. But I wonder if, there should be more focus on creating the best work for audiences in whatever market we're talking about, because the book is meant to stand on its own. Now, I'm not saying, that we can't lift some boats along the way. So I'm not just calling for sort of a Darwinian approach necessarily. But at the end of the day, it's sort of a bit like an elite sport. We're not talking about, like, writing is not for everyone. And maybe we should, you know what I mean? Like there seems to be this sort of participation trophy attitude when, to me, it seems like an elite sport. And yeah, either you can hack it or you can't. Like, I can't, you know what I mean? Did any of that make sense?
Yeah, I think that what you've identified is something that I've noticed too, which is, this tendency in certain parts of the conversation. I don't know how widespread it is. I see it a lot, but I'm in a certain bubble. But people talk about being able to do creative work and being paid to do creative work as though it's a prize for being like the best person, as opposed to being the best creator, for telling the best story. And you can actually see this kind of across the board, in terms of comedy, right? Like, there was a point at which people were like, well, Louis C.K. doesn't deserve to be successful. He doesn't deserve to make money off of his art because he's a bad man. And it's like, but that doesn't mitigate the fact that he's funny. And so, yeah, you do run into this question of, there's the people who we consider kind of, through the contemporary lens of the culture wars, people who we consider to be good or decent or deserving. And then there's the people who are telling the stories or, in the case of Louis C.K., the jokes that actually bring people to their feet applauding. And there's not necessarily a ton of overlap between these groups. So it's a conundrum.
Well, a short follow there. I have to know, while we're in this area, what is your take on allegedly or actually monstrous artists and their work, and how we should engage with that? So, like when you hear Thriller, do you turn it off, or do you smash the radio and say no, or do you dance?
I dance while smashing the radio. It's a very expensive habit. No, I mean, everybody has to kind of draw their own boundaries when it comes to this stuff. But personally, I've never had trouble, separating the art from the artist. I think that history is full of examples of really just terrible people who I would not, I wouldn't want to be married to them. I wouldn't even want to have them at my home for dinner, but who nevertheless, do incredible creative work. And I'm cool to, enjoy the product of their efforts, even if I wouldn't personally want to befriend them.
A lot of them seem like hard work. Bruce Willis sounds like, I know he's a bit sick now, but he sounds like terrible. I wouldn't want to, you know what I mean? Like, so...
Bruce Willis. I've never heard anything terrible about Bruce Willis. Mel Gibson.
Kevin Smith did a whole comedy special on how like Bruce Willis sucks. And he tells this big story about Kevin Smith goes, oh wow, he's working with him, and he said, hey Bruce, like, you know, this guy walked past him and said, hey man, Die Hard, and he goes, oh, isn't that great? That must be so good, right? And Bruce looked at him like dead in the eyes and said, I hate those people the most. So then again, that's kind of wonderful. Like, I think that's great in a way. You know, him being so villainous that he hates that.
Well, they do say you should never meet your heroes.
Yeah, or follow them on Twitter.
Well, I have a question about heroes, and I want to know, where are our heroes? I feel like everyone whose work I respected either remained silent, like Martin Scorsese, or they started telling us what they think. Stephen King, Margaret Atwood. Have you experienced any confusion, resentment, or disappointment of people whose work you loved in terms of their responses to the oppressive times we live in right now? Because I feel like, you know, we need some of these people to stand up and voice their concern about what's happening with art.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm of two minds about that. On the one hand, you know, I look at the sort of spate of celebrities weighing in on political questions. And again, I'm old enough to remember when that was sort of like almost frowned upon. You know, there was a point where, like, for instance, I think it was the 2004 Academy Awards, Michael Moore got on stage and said something expressly political,
fictitious president.
Yeah, he said like, shame on you, Mr. Bush, or something. And it was sort of polarizing at the time. People were like, not the time or the place. We don't really want to hear what you guys think about this, you know, what celebrities think about this. And now seeing how everybody is weighing in, you know, especially like you're talking about actors weighing in on fraught political issues and complicated political issues. I do often wish that they would just take a step back. You know, there are people who are paid to think about this stuff, who think about it much more deeply and who deserve a megaphone in a way that someone like Alyssa Milano doesn't, I'm sorry to say. But in terms of what's happening within the industries in which we all work, yeah, you know, I do wish that more writers would be brave enough to take a stand on the right of creators to imagine things. It's been disappointing to see how many writers who are, in fact, in a position where they're not really in any professional peril. You know, they're established, they have their audience, and no one's going to take that away. Nevertheless, and I think it's out of fear, feel compelled to go all in on this sort of like privilege disclaiming, cowering, obsequious stance, you know, to show that they're down with the cause. I don't love seeing that, just because I think it's bad for art, but I wouldn't want to call out anybody particularly or specifically on that front.
No, I will. It's Steven Spielberg.
Oh, you beat me to it, John.
He used the word Latinx endlessly recently, and it was the most embarrassing thing I've ever heard. It was like you could tell he didn't really know what it meant. He kept saying it like, we're going to look back at the documentaries and go, what the hell is this guy talking about?
Yeah, that's an interesting word, the Latinx or Latinx, because like so many of these terms, it's coined by people who don't actually speak out loud or like interact face to face with other people.
Internet losers. You're saying it's internet losers who've come up with this stupid language.
I wouldn't say losers. I would just say the extremely online. This is a whole genre of vocabulary that lives largely on the internet. And when it seeps out into the mainstream, you know, yeah, you do start to realize how ridiculous it is.
Well, whatever happened to Wimixon, which is the women spelt with an X?
That may be the first time that I've heard somebody try to pronounce that word out loud.
It's difficult.
Well, I think it's so dumb that it should be said. Like, if you're going to write it and you're going to say that this is a thing that we should be, again, like, if no one's going to say this is the worst thing I've ever heard, yeah, let's say it. Let's replace it. Let's try it on. Let's try it on. No? There was no question.
You guys go ahead. Right. It's like I'm not trying to pronounce that word.
Well, moving on. You've written a provocative piece blaming #MeToo for the toning down of Game of Thrones. The earlier seasons were definitely more sexy. They showed more flesh and were more bloodthirsty. Tell us, how did Me Too kill Game of Thrones?
Well, so I have to say that headline is not of my choosing and not what I would have chosen. But I think you can certainly see the impact of Me Too on Game of Thrones. And the new series is actually quite good. And while it's got less naked flesh in it, and I think that the sex scenes could probably be spicier. I don't notice it as a detriment to the show, because I think the writing and the storytelling is quite good on its own. But the idea of being responsive in the creation of a new series from this world to people who were so critical in this one particular way of the previous series, I think that that's a little bit, I don't know, there's something about it that I find frustrating. I feel like, there's this attempt to kind of eat their cake and have it. That, we want to delve back into this world, the Game of Thrones world that got us such incredible ratings. Everyone loved it. But we also, want to update it to adhere to these sort of progressive mores, which, these are things that like the fan base of the show didn't really care about. People who are sort of professionally offended on the internet made a lot of noise about this. And I'm not sure that those are the people who we want to necessarily be consulting, or at least consulting heavily when it comes to telling a new story. Are they really going to be the best expert on what makes for a compelling story?
Yeah, well, Game of Thrones is a show that, although it's fictitious, is set in a much earlier time historically, where, bad shit happened to loads of people, including women. Women often got the raw end of the bargain. Now, this is not a kids' show. It's a show written by adults for adults. Can we no longer be trusted to see the old Game of Thrones without turning into Harvey Weinstein? Because is there a larger problem of infantilization going on here, maybe?
Yeah, I think there is. And it's interesting. I actually just rewatched all of Game of Thrones because I wanted to revisit that story. And that show is incredibly critical of the patriarchal system in which its characters live. There's a lot that's, it's not a morality play, but it's as explicit as it can be, without sort of breaking the fourth wall and taking away from the story. There's this point in, maybe it's like the fourth or fifth season, where Cersei Lannister says, everywhere in the world they hurt little girls. And I mean, like, how much more in your face can you be, about the shortcomings of the patriarchy, especially as applied in a world like that. So, yeah, I do think that there's this risk of kind of dumbing down the messages to the sort of lowest common denominator of somebody who just wants to be punched in the face with morality when they turn on the television. And that's unfortunate, because it's not what most people want.
And rereading your piece, I'm glad you rewatched it all, because this sort of pertains to that. You can give us a better sense of how it all went over time. But after reading your piece again, I was just struck by how now I'm of this camp, how they totally blew it. You know what I mean? The first few seasons, I think, well, actually, I say few, I reckon the first maybe 6 were probably outstanding. They seemed, but more to the point, they seemed rock and roll or punk rock, bad manners, like proudly rubbing our faces in the horrors of humanity, murder, incest, rape, and power plays, which is, I think, what people were attracted to. Then one summer, they rolled back in, having done the work, all in capitals, and produced, they just took a left turn and gave us the ending we got. Now, whatever inspiration gave us the Red Wedding, I feel was totally gone. It was, which that episode is legendary. It's just like, it's so awful and so painfully true. It's true in the way that, that movie Boys Don't Cry is true, or Lars von Trier's, some of his movies are true in that way. You go, oh my God, that hurts so much, but it's true. And it felt like they didn't want to boldly go anymore. Now, if we just pull back, talk about Game of Thrones, but in general, if you agree, that is, where is that rock and roll or that punk spirit in art? Like, why is everyone being so considerate? I mean, I'm thinking of the scene of Cersei and Jaime, for instance, having incestuous sex in the tomb of their dead love child. You know, that's punk rock. You know, like what happened? What happened, Kat?
So punk rock. Oh gosh, I have so many thoughts about, because there are a lot of threads that kind of shoot off from everything that you just said. I mean, my first thought is that yes, you know, there was a definite decline in quality in the writing starting around season 6, but definitely moving into season 7 and then especially season 8. And I was just thinking about how as we concluded our rewatch, my husband turned to me at some point, I think during the scene where they're trying to decide how to choose their next king. He said, They really whizzed this down their leg, didn't they? And it's like, yeah, they did. Whizzed it down their leg. Of course.
That's a dreadful scene. That is the stupidest scene I've ever seen. It's totally against because you picture, we're geeking out a bit now, but there's that magical stuff when Max von Sydow's like attached to, there's a tree man or something, and like we're seeing visions from the future, and you're like, you're getting this awe, and you're like, oh my God, this story is bigger than my brain. And then suddenly it just cuts to a council meeting, like a local council meeting where they go, oh yeah, we're just going to pick a project leader. Oh, let's let it be Bran. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. You know, I cringed so hard that, you know, a vital organ nearly came out of my mouth. But I mean, the thing about that is not necessarily, I don't know. That's an interesting question. Okay, because so two things happened. One, you had the show attempting, I think, in real time to be responsive to some of the criticisms that started to dog it around the time that that Sansa was raped on her wedding night, and everyone was like, I'm never watching this show again. Of course, the people who were, you know, saying they were never going to watch this show again because of that, like, clearly had not been paying attention to the show up until that. Like, what did you think was going to happen? So there was this attempt to be responsive, I think, to that. But also, they ran out of source material. You know, George R.R. Martin had not written something that they not only could crib from, but were obliged to be faithful to. You know, he only could tell them the broad strokes of how the story was supposed to end. And I think that when they had to basically make it up, you saw the quality in the storytelling just kind of fall off a cliff.
What do you think of the idea, Kat, that the most dangerous and interesting stuff was arguably, not that I've read the source material, but I'm guessing was set in stone? So we don't get to have a meeting about the Red Wedding not being in the show. We don't get to have a meeting about, you know, the incest. We don't get to have a meeting about some of this stuff, you know, like or the people just buffing off the edges. You know, that's set in stone, and you can always stick behind that defense of, well, this is the text of the author, and we mustn't go against what the author says, which is really a way of saying, go away, we want to do something good and not something, you know, easy. So I feel like when we got a sense of what they could do, I mean, I saw people wearing plot armor. There were fan favorites wearing plot armor, just like who couldn't be killed. There were hookups, celebrity hookups, like just people, they're like, what if these two got together? And I'm like, what are you doing? And it became a Comic-Con celebration. There was a coffee cup left on set, like, which I think said everything to me, like, which they ended up CG'd it out. It was in the actual show.
Yes, that's right. No, yeah, that styrofoam cup.
Never forget the styrofoam cup. That is the show. That's what happened. They were too busy. They were doing a victory lap. That's that scene where they're all the creators are actually in the scene. That is the biggest rap party ever. They were like, let's just have an expensive rap party and film it and put it in the show.
Yeah. Was there a question in there?
I just had to get all that out, you know. I'm so annoyed. I can't stand. The question was about, you know, do you think that the structural things, you know, were they able to hide behind his great source material and being faithful to it, and then when they ran out and did what they had to do, were the forces, the anti-creativity forces, which is to be safe, to do, I don't know, like
sensitivity
politically expedient things to get sensitivity readers in, and, you know, did that machine take over at the end?
I think that I mean, I have no idea, but I think that you're probably onto something. I mean, being able to point to source material that's written in a particular way that contains certain plot points and certain themes. I mean, you know, George R.R. Martin's books are very big on subverting a lot of the tropes that the show kind of leaned into later. You know, for Ned Stark's head to be removed in the 9th episode of the first season. Like, you think he's the hero, and then they kill him. And I mean, that's for a reason. That show was written, I mean, the books were written to deconstruct a lot of your sort of expectations of, people wearing plot armor, of knowing who your hero is and getting to root for him, sort of safe in the knowledge that he won't be killed. So once there weren't books to rely on and to be faithful to, and a spirit, corresponding to be faithful to, I think that you probably are onto something, that it freed them to make certain choices that were ultimately, maybe politically expedient, but certainly terrible in terms of what it did to the storytelling.
Such a shame. It's OJ level fall from grace. Like, greatest, like, just amazing, the greatest athlete to the worst monster, like that, Although there were real people killed there, so I'm sorry if I shouldn't make that connection. So, Kat, you can disavow that. I will accept all of the
maybe
illegal...
you want to go back and take that out of the show.
No, I'm leaving it in. I'm leaving it in. I deserve what I get. All right.
Well, seeing as we're knee deep in film and TV, I'd love to get your perspective on the portrayal of women these days in, well, I guess we can narrow it down to American TV and movie. Are you annoyed by the endless slay queens and the sassy boss bitches that get rolled out?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, just because it's boring, right? It's a little one note. On the other hand, I mean, there are certainly a lot of really great stories being told. I mean, we're certainly in like a moment where there are like great female characters, being created. And so that's not a bad thing. But yeah, I guess there's something about the idea that, we're going to create a strong female character, and the way that she's going to be strong is that she's basically going to be a man, but with girl parts. Like, there's, maybe something about that that's a little bit ridiculous to me.
She-Hulk. Attorney at law.
I have not actually watched that show, so I can't weigh in.
No, well, it's for kids. I don't watch it either. But I have seen enough. There's a scene where she lectures the Hulk, who's another dumb character. I don't know what I'm talking about. It's Marvel. But like, she lectures the Hulk, and the look on his face, he's nodding along. He's going, just like taking the licks, like, And she's saying, what sort of stuff does she say, Ricky? It's like, I walk around, I get catcalled and stuff, and he's like,
yeah. So to me, that's that really has less to do with, women or female characters, and more to do with this tendency of writers to break the fourth wall in an attempt to instill the proper messages into a show. Make sure that like I said, you got to punch people right in the face with your moral message. You can't just kind of do it in a subtle way.
But do you think that, what's your view on morality and fiction and storytelling? Because what obligations and responsibilities do artists have? Oh,
I think that our responsibility is to our work, and that's really it. So if you're a writer of fiction, whether it's, on a screen or in the pages of a book, your responsibility is to your story, and you have to tell your story. Morality does not enter into it unless that's the story you're writing. If you're writing a morality play, then yes, for sure. But this idea that creators need to serve as role models, and not just in terms of, what they put on the page, but in terms of how they behave in their personal lives. I don't know. I think that that's problematic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, I taught some screenwriting to some kids, to some students, and I was trying to impress upon them, like I'd show them something like Eraserhead, and I'd say, or whatever I'd show them, and their first response was always to look at a film from a very paint by numbers moral sort of lens, and they had trouble, or when they correctly identified what the filmmaker or the storyteller was trying to do to them, in terms of making them feel bad, and feel that they got angry at that. And I'm like, no, that's what they want. And David Lynch, he wants you to have a bad time. He doesn't care about you. Doesn't want you to prosper. He wants you to hurt. and to maybe never recover.
Yeah, David Lynch does not want the best for you.
No, he doesn't. No. But they're used to seeing. Have you experienced this? That people that there seems to be this idea out there that stories are a manual for your life. They've all got to be Eat, Pray, Love or something, or they've all got to be about how whichever minority was secretly behind the moon landing or whatever. Like that seems to be a trope now. We go, okay, it was really done by these people, and you go, well, it might be a good movie. I don't know, but so. It's do you find that there's this very one-dimensional sort of view out there?
Yeah, I think that maybe some of what you're pointing at is not even about a desire to see moral messages in stories and in film, but about a desire to never feel uncomfortable. And we do live in that world, where people increasingly seek out and expect a frictionless experience. And this is true not just in terms of what kind of stories they're consuming, but also in terms of, like, when I order a pizza, I don't want to have to go through the anxiety of calling somebody and speaking to them on the phone to order the pizza. I want to do it on an app, and I never want to have contact with another human being. And same goes for something like dating. And I can't help thinking that, this is something that started in a broader place and has just sort of seeped into everything, including storytelling. And, on the one hand, I want to live in a world where writers and creators are brave enough to break people's hearts. On the other hand, I am absolutely one of these people where if I'm watching a movie that has a dog in it, I stop it and I Google whether the dog dies so I can prepare myself. So I don't know.
Don't worry about all the humans that die. It's whether the dog gets it.
Yeah, well, I don't practice what I preach on that front as a consumer. Although as an author, I did write a cat death into No One Will Miss Her that upset people a great deal, and people were like, I'm not going to finish this book because this cat died, and I'm like, the cat died 15 chapters after somebody found a severed human nose in a garbage disposal. But that wasn't off-putting to you. It was just the cat. Like, what priorities?
But in the movie, not only will the cat not die, it will be saved in the first 10 minutes by the hero.
All right, and then he'll turn to the camera and speak for 5 minutes eloquently about the dangers of white privilege.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, John and I, we watched Dancer in the Dark recently for another podcast we do where we review movies, and we were totally busted up, weren't we, John?
Yeah. I it's funny you should say about the word you said, Kat. There was this frictionless thing, and I'd forgotten how I'd pushed hard works out of my life a little bit. And we watched this, and I was inconsolable for so long, like minutes and minutes afterwards. And I had to tell my wife, and I've already said this, I might as well out myself. I came in and saw her, and I said, I've cried so much that I need to have a shower. That's how bad it was. Like it was, but having said that, I went through an experience. Like, we used to go to the cinema at a specific time and place. It's hard on streaming because stuff's going on. It's just content. Whereas you used to go and go, okay, I know this filmmaker or whatever, or I sort of know what I'm in for, but not really. And then you go and you have this feeling like I was a wreck, but then the next day I felt the way I was meant to. I felt catharsis, and it was beautiful. I could see the beauty. So I feel like that's been missing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a privilege to be able to feel things that deeply and to be able to have a story do that to you. And the idea of losing that, kind of on a species level, that is a tragic idea, isn't it?
Would you have been so busted up if you watched it on your Apple Watch?
Well, how you watch it does feed into it.
I think so.
Yeah, so totally. But no, you're right there, Kat. I feel like I want more of this. So we're fast running out of time, and I would love to hear about your new book, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, yeah, I'd be delighted. My new book comes out in the U.S. on January 10th, 2023. I don't know what that means for Australia, but it's called You Must Remember This, and it is a murder mystery. It's a sort of a Knives Out meets The Notebook. a gothic murder mystery that takes place on the coast of Maine on Christmas Eve, and then also in flashback to the 1940s. Yeah, it's I've always struggled to talk about the plots of my books because it's obviously, as a writer of thrillers and mysteries, you don't want to give too much away. But this story begins with a fractured family gathered at the home of their matriarch in Bar Harbor, Maine, Miriam. She is suffering from dementia. She's sort of on her way out. And when she dies, she's going to leave behind a $20 million fortune that her children are already starting to kind of squabble over. And on Christmas Eve, she slips out of the house. She walks onto the frozen cove. She falls through the ice and she dies. And it's a terrible accident. Or is it? And her granddaughter, Delphine, becomes convinced that maybe something untoward happened to her grandmother. And so the story tracks both, Delphine's investigation into her grandmother's death and her life. And then as a reader, you also flash back in time to Miriam's youth. You find out how she met the man who she would marry, and made a series of decisions that would change her life and haunt her for the rest of it. And in the end, things wrap up with a twist. That's all I'll say about that.
Just quickly, what is it about the mystery genre that you're drawn to?
Gosh, I mean, these are the kind of stories that I love to read. And so I think also just it makes sense that they're the kind of stories I love to tell. I love the puzzle of it, and I love the constructing backwards that you do when you're writing a story that leads up to a twist that you have to kind of keep hidden throughout. You have to build all these layers around it so that your reader understands that something is there. They maybe catch little glimpses of like a piece of it, but they don't know the whole thing. You kind of keep it shrouded. And at the same time as they're taking this journey towards it, like peeling away the layers, that has to be interesting in its own right. So it's a fun challenge to construct a story in that way.
That sounds great, and I'll have to check it out. I greatly appreciate the Casablanca reference. I think that's people deserve that. To know.
Now, Kat, we're fast running out of time. In fact, we are out of time. But we have a final question we ask all of our guests, and that is, we'd like to know what you're reading right now.
Oh, gosh. What I'm reading right now, this is a boring answer, but I'm rereading Tara Isabella Burton's Social Creature because I'm working on a story for which it is sort of a point of inspiration.
That's okay. We hear all sorts of smart people. I hear a lot of, I'm reviewing this book for, I got to read. So it's fine. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kat, for being so generous with your time and great insights on something we don't get to talk about enough, fiction and storytelling and whatnot. I think people are so wrapped up in the cultural wars, we don't get to delve into this stuff too much. So thank you so much.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, Kat, if people want to follow you, are you on social media? Can they do that via, say, Twitter or Facebook?
Yeah, you can find me on all of the platforms. Facebook I've been totally neglecting, so maybe don't look for me there. But it's on Twitter and Instagram. I'm Kat Rosenfield. It's Rosenfield with an I in it, not Rosenfeld. And yeah, I would be delighted to have anybody follow me.
And I encourage everyone to listen to Kat's podcast, Feminine Chaos, which is wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience.